So what we're going to do to try to figure out what's reasonable for us to believe is that we're going to adopt a certain method of inquiry. And what we're going to try to do is consider the various positions you can take on an ethical issue or moral issue. And we're going to consider the best reasons in support of each position, whichever position, however many positions you can take. And we're going to consider the best ones and figure out which ones are really good arguments or which ones are better than others to decide really what would be reasonable for us to believe. But in doing that, we're going to have to consider the reasons and arguments. And when we talk about an argument, remember, we're talking about a set of reasons that are embedded in statements that are intended to support, provide evidence for, justify, or make rational, reasonable a certain statement or belief. That's what an argument is. It is not, in our class, a dispute between two people, although in a dispute, people give arguments in favor of their side. And we see that all arguments have two parts. First part is the point that they're trying to make, the claim that they're making, which is the conclusion. It's the claim that's being defended. That people are giving reasons that defend or support it. And in addition to which, you need the reasons or the premises, the statements which are intended to provide support for one another. That is, we have two parts to arguments, the conclusion and the premises. And we write them down in standard form, right? We number premises, we draw a line or write therefore, and then we get to the conclusion. Now the issue is, how do we evaluate whether an argument is good? And remember, we said there were really two criteria, and we'll go into some detail. There were two criteria that make an argument good. First of all, the reasons have to have a very strong connection to that the claim being defended, the conclusion. And second of all, the reasons have to be true. So that's how we're going to decide. Now, in deciding it, we're going to use logic. Now, logic, the definition of logic as the discipline in philosophy is the science of the study of the principles of correct or reliable inference and reasoning. It's concerned with the connection between the premises and the conclusion. It answers the question, if we assume that the premises or the reasons are right, must we accept the conclusion? And if the logic is good, yes. If the logic is bad, no. A good argument must display good logic, a good connection between premises and conclusion. That is, it has to be what we call valid. Now remember, we've been using terms truth, argument, premises, conclusion, valid. These are all technical terms in philosophy that mean something different than the way they're ordinarily used oftentimes in English. And remember, when we come into this class, we're only using it in the strict and philosophical sense. So when we say an argument is valid, we're saying it displays good logic, it makes good inference from the premises to the conclusion, it displays good reasoning, or there's a logically strong connection. And we defined it in this way. That is, we said an argument is valid just means if the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion. If the premises are true, then the conclusion must also be true. It exhibits good logic, a valid argument. The inference of the conclusion from the premises displays a logically strong connection. Another way of saying, a couple more ways, it's impossible for those premises to be true and the conclusion false. But remember, it's iffy. Look at the parenthesis. If the premises are true, then the conclusion is true. If the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. Logic doesn't tell us what happens if the premises are false. And one way of putting, when we're talking about impossible here, it's impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. It's if you start describing a situation in which the premises are true, and then you start to try to describe continue to describe the situation where that conclusion that was reached is false, we're going to end up contradicting ourselves. We're going to say something like something is round and then it's square. Not possible. Now just let me remind you of one thing. Can a valid argument have a false conclusion? All fish have wings. All things with wings can fly. Therefore, all fish can fly. Is the logic good in that argument? Yeah, the logic is perfect. Remember, we're talking about the connection between those premises and the conclusion. That's not a good argument, though, because there's another problem. It's a valid form of argument, but the conclusion's false. So a valid argument can have a false conclusion, right? Because when we're talking about valid, we're only talking about one of the criteria of a good argument, that is the logic of the argument. What you can have is a valid argument, all of whose premises are true, and the conclusion is false, right? Because valid argument, there's a good connection. Those premises invariably lead you to that conclusion. If the premises are true and they lead you to that conclusion, the conclusion has to be true also. Just to summarize our terminology, in philosophy we talk about a sound argument, which is what a good argument is. It has two characteristics. Makes a valid inference, there's good logic. And remember, we're talking valid is not truth. Valid is the connection, and also it has true premises. So it displays good logic, and it has good factual content. A valid argument is a logically strong argument. As we said, the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion. So there are our criteria for figuring out if we have a good argument. And if we find a good argument whose conclusion is a certain claim taking a certain position on an ethical problem, we have the right answer. And that's why we're going to be looking at various arguments, or the best arguments we can find for various moral positions, to find out what in fact is correct in ethics. If the argument is sound, remember, the conclusion is true. So never say, well, the argument's sound, it's a good argument, but I don't agree with the conclusion. Well, if you think that conclusion's false, one or two things has to be true. Either there's a problem with the logic in that argument, or there's a problem with one of the premises, that the premises are not true. Valid arguments, logically strong argument. It's impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false at the same time. Sound argument, good argument. Valid and true premises. And just remember something. There can be many bad arguments to support a true conclusion. Bad argument just doesn't give good reasons to a reason to believe the conclusion. It doesn't mean the conclusion is true. Let's say you are listening to a philosophy lecture. Well, if somebody says, hey, I can show you why, I have an argument to show that you are listening to Legum is bald. Therefore, you're listening to a philosophy lecture. That's a horrible argument. It's a bad argument because there's no connection between that premise and the conclusion. It's bad logic. But the fact that you have a bad argument doesn't mean that you're not listening to a philosophy lecture. Because just from the fact that you've identified that an argument is bad, don't jump to the wrong conclusion that it gives you reason for thinking that the conclusion is not true. A bad argument leaves everything up in the air. If the argument's bad, you don't have any way of determining whether the position is right or wrong.